Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with writer and theorist and Professor of History and Theory of Architecture at MIT, Mark Jarzombek, about his 2023 book, Architecture Constructed, Notes on a Discipline, published by Bloomsbury.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Mark Jarzombek about his recent book, Architecture Constructed, Notes on a Discipline, published by Bloomsbury. But before we get to that, Mark, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi, Ambrose. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you today. My name is Mark Jarzombek. Teach architectural history and theory at MIT.
There you go. I'm always impressed by the short intro, the short bio. Some people like to go on. Did you train in architecture? Is that your background as an architect, or was it straight into his history and theory?
No, I have an architectural degree from the ETH in Zurich. So I did a diploma there, and I had a practice for about a year or so. Before that, I was at the University of Chicago and majored in physics and philosophy. And so this book, in a sense, puts some of those strands together.
Yeah. Yes, it's you have a very storied publishing history, but this feels quite like you're tying things together, like there's a kind of totalizing vision within it, which makes it a very elegant read. But I thought perhaps we could start with what your motivations for writing the book were at this particular juncture. I mean, books always have a kind of genesis, and as you say, yours is all books, I suspect, have a quite long history, pre-life to them. But why did you feel like this book was the one for the moment?
Well, as I point out somewhere in the footnotes of the book, this book came about through the lectures that I give to my students. So I'm in charge of a class that I call Thinking About Architecture, to the MArch students and part of the curriculum there. And many people, would probably, I've tried to explain, what is that class? I would probably say it's something like a theory class. And that would be its sort of conventional slot. But I don't like to use the word theory because it divides the world into theory and practice, into this dualism again. And we're haunted by endless crisis of dualism, which really annoys me. So the title of class is Thinking About Architecture. So we try to think about it in many different ways. And over the decades, I begin to sort of develop this, the thoughts, on this book. And then I thought, it's very, to some degree, relatively personal, and no one would ever publish it, and so over COVID, I then decided to wrap it up and give it to the press, and here we are.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. It is a very interesting book because it does deal with, this perennial issue around the dualism in architecture. I mean, perhaps this is the split between thinking and making, is it not?
Yeah, the split between thinking and making, which we seem to be stuck in, it's sort of like, well, is there an alternative to that? Well, in a way there is. It's just that we can't really imagine it. And what I'm arguing in the book is that split is a construction. So when we think about construction, we think of it through the lens of technology or the building industry or steel and glass or things like that. But what I'm arguing is that the discipline of architecture is itself a construction, a social construction. So it didn't just appear out of nowhere as a done deal, even though we sort of think it's finished and there's no real alternative to it. That may be the case, but it's definitely something that has its own history. And how did we get to this place where this dualism is just sort of completely natural? And then, I sort of realized we really haven't asked that question. which seems to be a very logical question from a historian's point of view, and if we sort of trace it back, when did this social construction of this dualism appear? We wind up, of course, with the Greeks, and so it's a long history that we have sort of naturalized, and that we need to basically see and bring into visibility. That's sort of the task of the book, is to not to necessarily critique it and say something like wrong with it as such, but to help us actually see it operating, because we all know it's there. It's just like there's no no one is surprised when you say that thinking and making are different. We all say, yeah, it's obviously right. So the answer, we know the answer, we just don't know how it sort of got to be the answer. That was what I was trying to trace out in the book.
And so you say we start with the Greeks. The origins of this kind of duality, this dualism, starts with the Greeks. But I think at the very beginning of the book, in fact, it's right on the front page, you start with, of the preface, you start with Alberti, Leon Battista Alberti. And it's him that sort of sets up, for the modern epoch, the modern period, he sets up this kind of, the architect as something distinct from the medieval idea of the master builder, stonemason with bells on kind of thing. Is that right?
Oh, that's correct. Yes. I'll start with Alberti because he does sort of launch that dualism into the modern era. And basically he says in his preface that, that if you want to make architecture into a discipline, which is what we would sort of say what we have, you need basically to talk to people who have read the books and know the field. It's very clear in saying that the builder, the Faber, the person who makes the buildings, has to be sidelined in this conversation and does not really have a voice, and basically says the builder is an instrument, and he uses that word, an instrumentum. So if the builder is just an instrument, and instruments don't have opinions or voices, right? I'd pick up a hammer. It has no opinion about whether the nail is is hit the right way or not. It's obviously hit the nail, and then shut up. So basically, Alberti says that the builders and the contractors should basically shut up and just be hammers. And this is an astonishing claim when you think about it. And he's building on this tradition that comes out of the Greek and classical idea, that the intellectual speaks, that these are aristocrats, that aristocrats know something, and the builders who are not aristocrats and laborers, they should basically be quiet and accomplish whatever has to be done. It's sort of not exactly like in the military, but it's very clear that there's a chain of command. And Alberti wants that chain of command to be with the architect. And as I point out in the book, that this was somewhat ironic, because in that day and age, to be an architect, you could be a painter, you could be Brunelleschi was a goldsmith. He has no architectural training. People didn't have it. There weren't MITs and universities, architecture schools in those days, right? You became an architect by becoming a builder, then working your way up the ranks. So Alberti is saying, no, I don't, that's not how it goes, So he didn't have any substantial evidence for the fact that the architect knows things better than the builder, but he was protesting against the idea of these upstart builders who were making all these things. And so it was a thin edge of a wedge. And basically today, it has completely been normalized, across the field.
It's a really interesting parallel. I wonder whether that the alienation that various theorists and historians have written about of the modern age, and trace its origin point back to that period of Enlightenment, to the period of the beginning of the Renaissance or the Reformation. I wonder if there's a kind of correspondence in what you're saying with, say, for example, Marx's description of the emergence of the working classes, that the working classes are in a way a construction of a new middle class who generate them to operate as a tool, to operate as in Marx's analysis of the emergence of industrialism or modernity. And I'm squeezing different concepts together there, I admit, but there's a kind of an abandonment of a kind of reciprocity between the worker and the authority figure, the lord of the manor, whoever it is, towards a kind of instrumentalizing of the physical capacity of the working classes and a dismissal of their kind of intellectual knowledge, their lay knowledge, their vernacular knowledge.
Well, that's correct. I mean, Marx, of course, tried to invert that relationship, right? The laborer is sort of on top, and the laborer brings the types of knowledge-based and epistemologies that are necessary to redeem labor into the social world, right? Now, the problem, let's say for me, when I was writing this book, is that the architecture, to build architecture, because it's such in other words, the architecture is not an industrial product, at least up until very recently.
Mm-hmm.
It was still required carpenters and bricklayers and ditch builders. To make a building, you need 100 different types of laborers. Whereas Marx is basically talking about a type of industrial labor that comes out of mass production. And so that labor, until very recently, really didn't play itself out in the building industries. So in other words, one can't, as much as one could say, yeah, Marx tried to solve it, it didn't trickle down, if you will, intellectually into the building industries, because the building industries in the 19th century was very dismembered by the capitalistic regimes of the time. So the guilds were taken apart, and it became a little bit like neoliberalism in a way, right? Every person could become a carpenter,
Mm-hmm.
Go out and try to make yourself, first by being a carpenter, and then by being a master carpenter, and then by being a master builder, and maybe by the end of your life, you could call yourself an architect, and things like that. So the Marxist model didn't fit architecture, in a real way, and it was a different type of labor. And so, in a funny way, this old Greek separation between the thinking people, and the doing people survived the Marxist critique, right? It just sort of like oil and water. They didn't quite know how to figure that out, right? Because the only exception to that, I say, however, was in the in tall buildings, skyscrapers and the like, where you had steel and concrete, where you had industrial scale labor productions. And that's where the labor unions, of course, developed. But in domestic sphere, domestic architecture, houses, still today, we did a project, for my barn in the back, and, it was not much different from the Middle Ages, in terms of how labor was appropriated and organized. And two or three carpenters come, and they're on their own. They're not part of any union. And then two or three guys who do the shingles come, and two or three guys who do the sheetrock, they come, that type of thing. In that sense, that type of architectural production is still very medieval.
It's really interesting. The subtitle of the book, Notes on a Discipline, I think is something that needs sort of unpacking, I suppose. And it's this idea of discipline, which, as I said in my notes to you yesterday, sorry for getting them to you so late, but I think for the notion of a discipline perhaps would come as a surprise to some of the people that I teach, perhaps all of the people that I teach, because architecture isn't seen as a discipline so much as a series of technological moves. It comes back perhaps to this idea around the tools, particularly in contemporary architecture, which is highly technical and tool-based. The production and the design, production, and maintenance of architecture and its measurement, in a way, is all derived from technology of tools. So they come to architecture schools perhaps increasingly expecting to acquire tool skills, which are directly related to regulation and law, and also product size, building product size. And they might be very ethical in their view, like socially just or interested in various kind of overarching social justice issues, but sometimes quite narrow. But they wouldn't, I don't think, necessarily think of themselves as perhaps philosophically grounded or that concerned. But I was, yeah. So the idea of the discipline, I think, is kind of interesting. And I would be really interested to hear how you are defining discipline and how architecture is a discipline compared to, say, other disciplines within public discourse and academia.
Great. Yeah, excellent question. It gets right to the matter of the book, because when I was putting the word into the title, the editors are going, "Oh my God, discipline. Ooh, that's boring," and people aren't going to want to know that, But I sort of insisted, and they agreed. I mean, it's really what I'm trying to say is that Verdi, that's why I started with him, makes a big deal about wanting to make a discipline that didn't exist at the time. What did he mean by that? Well, disciplines require libraries, they require books, a reading capacity, right, to understand that there's a past of a wealth of information that has to be collected. So there's no such thing as a discipline without a library, right? And the library has to contain all sorts of things, right, about practice. So even though we think of architecture often through the lens of practice, all the schools of architecture will have libraries because that's where the discipline resides, right? That's the semiotics of what a discipline is to have a library. And the better the school of architecture, I'm speaking maybe somewhat loosely here, the better this library will be. And there's a school of architecture being created in China, and my friend is helping them, buy thousands and thousands of books for the library. So that's the sign of a discipline, right? Now, it's more than just, of course, that it has a library where you can go, a repository of information and things. It also has to have gatekeepers, people that say, yes, you belong to the discipline or not. And so that's what an MArch degree is, right? A MArch degree is our gatekeeping system. And that means it has to have schools, and it has to have tenure, professors who are tenured. It has to have criteria of how the teachers are tenured and how they're monitored, and so forth and so on, right? So the discipline isn't an abstract thing. It's a huge machinery of reality, right? Pedagogical briefs, right? We have a curriculum committee, right? that meets, every other month or so and goes over the things that we should be teaching or not teaching. We have NAAB giving us accreditation that approves how we teach and so forth, like that. The ACSA, or these, these organizations in architecture, wherever they are in different countries, help promote architectural practice in certain ways and so forth. So the discipline is huge. It's ginormous. It operates in across dimensions, right? From teaching to practice, from buying books to tenure cases and so forth and so on. And it's so big in a way that you can't really put your arm around it, right? You can't really say, let's make a history of the discipline. So that's why the title is Notes, because there's no way you could even approach a type of history of this. I mean, it's just so complicated. It's like amorphous, right? Like a Rubik's cube. You start on one side and you could end up another side and not even know the difference. So the best I could do was try to singularly point to this one particular aspect of the discipline and how it's constructed, which has to do with the vocabulary. So I'm saying that we have an advantage in that the word architecture is a dual word, right? It's made out of two words.
Mm-hmm.
So, music is one word, right? Art is one word. So I don't know. But architecture, right, is made out of two words that were put together. And it's not a word that was natural to the Greeks, right? The Greek invented this word. So it was a neologism, in the 6th century or 5th century BC. So already then we sort of have to realize that as an invented word for the Greeks themselves, right, they were combining two things that existed separately to try to sort of put them together. And we still haven't solved how to put them together. And so the book is trying to sort of say that this discipline, because of the very word, allows us like a X-ray machine to sort of actually see these two words and the history of this tension
Mm-hmm.
between the arche, let's say the thinker or the creative type, and the techne, which is the builder and the maker type, right? And so the word and the discipline coincide in that way, right? I mean, it's not an old word. That's what I'm trying to say, right? It's actually, as architecture goes, a very new word and very young word, right? It is, and this neologism still is with us today because we still haven't figured it out.
Mm. I was talking today, I was doing a couple of lectures this morning for an open day, and you have all of these fresh-faced 16, 17-year-olds and their eager-looking parents as you try and persuade them to part with a large section of the remnants of their youth and also the value of their house in paying for it. And you have to explain there's this very strange thing, as you say, where you want to, on the one hand, emphasize the disciplinary character of architecture. As you say, the library, the theory, the rubrics around which it plays. But at the same time, you want to persuade the parents that the student is going to be very eminently capable, particularly around areas of practical concern, which is building. And so that tension lives, I think, even in the public imagination. It's not just the discipline. The problem of the discipline isn't just one of the discipline itself. It's not a kind of internal anxiety, but it is actually a public anxiety, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I mean, architecture always speaks to some sort of higher project.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk to the builders, ethical responsibility or sustainability or, all these things, we're like, well, okay, I don't know, whatever, fine, But architecture, because of its association with aristocracy and nobility and with thinking and with purposefulness and so forth, and with theory, always glues to itself, right, these higher and more noble values, which is great. I mean, I'm not in any way protesting against that, right? It's just that there becomes very quickly a split in this discipline between how to translate that into practical things, right? So, my colleague and I, Vikram Prakash, we have an office called the Office of Uncertainty Research. And we do all sorts of studies. And we took a house in Seattle recently. This is in a Biennale project, to not this recent Biennale, but the previous one. And we looked at where everything came from. And it was a sustainable house. The architect and the contractor said, this is, green, completely green. But most of that was really completely inaccurate. I mean, the floor, the sustainable oak floor, where it came, we figured it out where it came from, which was in southern Germany, from a forest there. It traveled twice around the world to get fabricated in Indonesia, then to Korea. I don't know if you call that sustainable. That's like, I mean, I don't know what the hell it is. So I'm saying it is, in other words, architects live in a weird world where we can sort of say things are sustainable, and the clients go, yes, yes, yes. But the reality is, when we get down to the building part of it, it's not, right? So these hypocrisies are so the dark side of that division between the arche and the build and the tecton, right? There's a good sides to it as well, but we have to understand that they're both good sides and bad sides. The good side, of course, is when the architect tries to speak to the higher ambitions, the ethical requirements, whatever those may be. But the reality is that these aren't always implementable or implemented the right way, and we don't really want to admit that.
Yeah. You talk about the estrangement, and you seem to suggest that there is an origin point to this, which I'm guessing is the birth of, I don't know if it's fair to say, but there seems to be a kind of jumping from the classical period into the birth of the modern period, the Renaissance. And I don't know, but the birth of the Renaissance constitutes this new rupture period, which you describe as the moment at which there is this disastrous splitting of theory and practice. Why do we? So why is this point seen as being significant?
Okay, so basically, what I'm sort of saying is that Baroque, classical, these concepts sort of don't exist in this world, right? In other words, the moment Socrates basically walked around with the smart young men of Athens, who were all slaveholders, and Socrates calls the working people bonassos, and the actual bonasso people who were building the houses and cleaning them were all slaves. So in other words, he doesn't really feel Socrates is the great hero of the intellectual world of the Western society, because he's killed himself, in the name of, wanting to preserve the integrity of his thoughts, and he sacrificed himself, literally for that. And so he's, for right reasons, seen as, one of the great intellectuals of our age. But basically, he didn't really think too hard about the separation between thinking people and the working class. The working class, or these aristocrats in Athens at that time, were all slaves who had been conquered or from other peoples and learned how to do a skill, and they survived in that way. And Plato was even worse, and Plato, was much more vertical about things. And these people should shut up and do stuff, right? And so, so in other words, that history is the history of a modernity, if you will, that regardless of whatever style or whatever other things, that never goes away. So what changes is, in some sense, the instrumentality of that core principle. So Alberti tries to institutionalize it into, let's say now it's something called a discipline, which didn't exist in the medieval period, right? So he tries to create ex nihilo a discipline. And that took a long time for it to develop. So MIT was the first school of architecture in the United States in the 1860s, when it was created by a man, Professor Ware, W-A-R-E, who was, very insistent that to be called an architect, you need to have a degree. You can't be a glorified contractor. And in the United States at that time, 95% of the architects were glorified contractors who just called themselves an architect because they could. So, the AIA, the Institute for Architecture in England and other places began to say, no, to be an architect, you have to have degrees, right? Now Alberti was going, thank God, but it took, from 1500 to 1840, right? It took 350 years for finally someone to listen to me. So that sort of the long nature of the discipline. I barely thought it through, but there was no MITs at that time. There were no schools of architecture in Florence or anywhere, right? So it took a long time for these idea of the school of architecture to basically come into play. And the school of architecture basically said, we're training architects, not builders. And so the first thing that Ware did was collect the drawings. He made a library, which we still have. He bought all these books. He made pedagogies, right? He taught the students how to speak French, because if you want to be a spokesperson for cultural, things, you'd have to learn French, because that's where the Beaux-Arts was, right? You have to be able to understand that language, right? So that's what I mean by the discipline had to have been created and born, but it took a long time for that to happen. So that modernity is in some sense not a sort of a moment in the traditional sense. We think of, let's say, a classical age or the Baroque age and then a modern age, right? I'm sort of saying that modernity was born in Nietzsche in the slaveholding class in Athens, but took centuries to develop the actual idea of what a discipline sort of is, and sort of mature in that way, right? Like good wine, it sort of takes some time, right? But, and as I said earlier, in other words, the Marxist critique of labor didn't get into this because it was still about, for Ware, building an elite class, not a class of builders. We had plenty of builders in the United States. Every other person was a builder of some sort because of just the way, America had to be made, Every farmer, was making their own houses and so forth like that, And Ware wanted, to think of the French and the Beaux-Arts system as producing an elite class of people who were called a different way. And you had to then exclude the builders from that. You had to tell them, no, you're just different, different pay scale, different, you don't get to talk to the clients, things like that.
I wonder if there's something about this sort of this character, as you say, that the way that architecture has not been affected by the same kind of class discourse that other arts-based industries or creative industries or material culture industries have been, because again, going back to these couple of talks I gave this morning, you explained to students how an architecture degree in Britain is structured, which is you do a 3-year degree and then you go out into practice and you can earn a certain amount of money, but you've got to find that job yourself. And we don't help you. I might post a few emails out if an employer writes in and says we're looking for a part 1 or a part 2 architect. But we don't help you, and then they come back. And in a way, there is something inherently, because architecture has this belief in genius, and it does, even if it pretends it doesn't, even when we kind of talk about the constructed nature of the discipline, or even when we talk about the pluralist nature of, a la Dana Cuff's books or Albania Yaneva's books about the way that architecture actually is produced through a kind of concoction, a network of people. Deleuzian kind of ideas of the in a way, we still look for the genius. So it doesn't really matter if the discipline offers forward a structured kind of curriculum of things to know, because ultimately we're always on the lookout for the man or woman who interprets it the best. And so it's sort of inevitably individualistic in this way, because of its strange identity as something between a science, something between an art, something between building construction, something between, I don't know, contract management and law, and because it's a master of a jack of all trades and a master of quite a few of them as well. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. The yeah, let's say the star architect phenomenon, of the 90s and 2000s and so forth like that, was a symptom of how culture, and even the profession or the discipline,
Mm-hmm.
promotes and self-promotes this idea of genius. And in the book, I talk about how Immanuel Kant, the great father of liberal politics, we all, who could not like Immanuel Kant for his sort of idea of his political point of view, but he basically very clearly said there are two types of work. There is the work of genius, and the work of a genius produces what he calls an opus, using the Latin phrase. And the work of a worker, the ditch digger, is Arbeit, and he uses a German word, Arbeit or Arbeiter, a worker. And so he once again in the Enlightenment, reinforces the fact that there are two types of labors, right? Mm-hmm. One is the work of the genius, who makes a cumulative labor, opus, like Le Corbusier's oeuvre complète, right? Which is exactly what Kant would be talking about, is the act of a genius, right? Making cumulative production. Whereas the worker, the Arbeiter, who just does work for money, is what he says, the workers do. They're only paid for it. So there's no accumulation there. There's no either accumulation of work, of money for them, right? He's completely not interested in that, but there's also no cultural accumulation. They just do something, right? So it's Teflon, right? And so that distinction, is a nightmare distinction when you think about it. It sort of takes the once again the Greek distinction between thoughtful young men and the working slave class, and just redefines it, into the 19th century between two types of working people, mm-hmm. the creative people and the dull Arbeiter. Mm. And it's just like we can't get away from it. No. And still today we have, the idea that architecture is a place where we could find and nurture certain types of geniuses. Now, the irony is that we want those people. We don't, it's not like we say we don't want geniuses, we want smart people. But can we have smart people without having this dualism? That's what I sort of say.
Yeah. Because you talk about in a way that through the use of language, you seem to me to be exploring also, because you use this word architecton and you put non in the middle of it. So it's a neologism of your own, which is archinontecton, which I think is good because it still trips off the tongue nicely. Right. But there is this, in the way that you describe it, there are these silent aspects, because you cross out the non as well, because we're not allowed to even engage with the idea that the non is there. And there is this repeated refrain throughout architectural history of getting back in contact with the building, Heidegger's idea, or Rudowski's idea, or any number of theorists have tried to get us back to there, and people are still doing it now. But I quite like this idea of the silent, but the way that disciplinarity also anonymizes significant aspects of what we do as a way of, is it as a mechanism to elevate and actually establish the discipline? What I mean is, does the discipline exist without this anonymization? Is the silencing of the worker, but also the silencing of the technologies that the worker uses, the tools. You talk a bit in the book about scaffolding, all the languages. The vast array of technologies that actually enable the arche to do its thing. There's something quite pernicious about that. But yeah, does the discipline actually require that silencing?
Yes, I think the architecture field is getting better at that in the last decade or so. But so and and I talk in the book. I'm not making it all dark, doom and gloom.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, the point is, in some senses, perhaps a strange optimism that we can actually see this better today than we could before, and not get rid of it, because that's never going to happen, but begin to, in some sense, work better, better with it. But the old ways still persevere in a way. At MIT campus, for example, there are a lot of corridors, very famously called infinite corridors. And you walk along these corridors, and every 100 feet or so, you come to a black door with no number on it. And these doors belong to the cleaning contingent. And during the day, you never see them open, right? But if you go there like 6 or 7 o'clock, you see someone going in there or someone coming out, and they're basically where the mops are kept, and the sprays and the cleaning. There's a sink in there and all that type stuff. So this is once again that silencing bit, where the architecture literally puts into its fabric, like Swiss cheese, these spaces throughout the building that are inhabited by invisible people who come out at 6 p.m., do the cleaning, and then disappear. So you don't encounter them during the day ever. And that may be convenient for them as well as, for us, because they have these big carts that they drive around, with the stuff, and you don't want that interfering with the flow of traffic in the corridors. So there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense. But it also speaks, however practical it may be, to the reality that these people who maintain the building are invisible. We absolutely have no idea who they are, right? Unless you actually go up and talk to them and introduce yourself, which I've done on a number of occasions. And these are the people who are responsible for keeping the building going, right? So this is just one little, like a tapas example of how the arche silences the presence of the tecton. In this case, having to do with the maintenance crew. And, I don't necessarily, there might be a thesis project to figure out how can we do something different, right? But this is the classic sensibility, I would say, of that relationship between the creative people doing the work during the day and the tecton people cleaning the building at night, invisible, nameless people, right? And underappreciated and unknown, right? So that, as I'm saying is that even though I think we're getting better, we still have inherited the burden of trying to see and understand these situations. So another example, which is, maybe get back to the core of the discipline, I put that in my book. I said, in other words, if you want to do a theory course and you mention, for example, craftsmen, you will read probably Richard Sennett's book called The Craftsman. Or you mentioned Heidegger, Now, the Library of Congress system that we use throughout the United States, which was created in the 1890s, is sort of right out of sort of Alberti's, dream world, right? It's ranked from smart to dumb. So you have theology, and philosophy. These are B's, right? And it goes down, 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 down. And anything written by people in the working class are in the T's or U's or V's. So if you're an actual craftsman and you write a book about craftsmanship, it's going to be categorized probably in the T. Whereas Richard Sennett, who, I don't know if he's ever lifted a hammer in his life, writes a whole massive book on the craftsman. And he's with the smart people at the top of the heap, B, because he's supposed to know something. So this radical displacement and alienation between the smart people who talk about craftsmen who are elevated into the Bs and the actual craftsmen whose book is down there in the Ts and you don't even like hardly would ever read their stuff, is a symptom, another symptom of this dualism that is very pernicious.
Mm. Your book is divided into 21 sections. There's seven sections with 3 chapters each, and there's so much in it, and it's it's beautifully written, beautifully illustrated. But there was one area that I was interested around, which was that I picked on in my questions to you, and I just thought we could perhaps, because as you say, your book isn't doom and gloom. It certainly doesn't have that tone about it. It's a book with a great deal of positivity and dissecting the problem without I don't know.
Without killing the patient.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Without killing the patient is a very good way of putting it. But I picked on this word libidinal that you use, and I wanted to understand that. You said, and you connect it to deconstructivism. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. Is there in the disciplinarity, in this elevation of the intellectual content of the discipline, there is also, in a peculiar kind of way, a fetishization of the making side of things, and almost in a way an eroticization of the making. And you see that in, say, Rudowski's work or Gottfried Semper's work or William Chambers, where there's this attempt to understand the origins as if it's a purer and more honorable and in a way more real way of being or of designing buildings. I mean, you see it obviously in Logier's Noble Savage, where there's this idea about like honesty and integrity, and it's deeply colonialist and deeply problematic in many ways. And I was wondering whether you could talk about this word and where you see it kind of revealing itself in late modernism and in the contemporary period.
Well, I think you summarized it very elegantly. Basically, I was trying to point out that when Corbusier celebrates the engineer, this is a sort of masculinist fantasy. So it's not just a disciplinary project anymore, right? It sort of leaks into a space where we have a man talking about the disguisedly, of course, talking about the value of the engineer who brings clarity and rationality and precision, to bear. And so this attachment that the arche has to the maker, to the person who makes these things, in this case, the engineer, right, is not a practical one, or it is, I say it's a libidinal one, because it sort of brings out an implicit sort of erotic relationship, but of the masculine project, which is strong and clear and rational. And so I use that as a way to begin to parse out certain sets of buildings that I think play in that. So one of them was, Ando's building, which was the Modern Art Museum at Fort Worth, where he has these sort of figure-like structural systems. It's a post with that, there's like a V on top of it. It looked like a man holding up the building, walking down. And so I'm saying, in other words, where its honesty in holding, in where we're seeing the structure, is offset by the fact that structure is doing its work, right? It's powerful, it's strong, it's masculine, and whereas there are other ways to do this, and I talk about the Helmut Jahn's book building, in Chicago, which unfortunately I think is going to get torn down, at the Illinois State Center, where we have more of a weird scaffolding effect. In other words, there's no strong, singular, masculine set of beams and posts, right? But a type of filigree of lightweight scaffolding things, right?
Yeah.
And it's a different type of more gentle libidinal project, you know. And
A
I
romantic libidinal rather
Yeah,
than
that's right. Yeah, it's not. It's very technological. That
yeah.
building, you walk in there and you feel like you're in a spaceship of some sort. But unlike the Ando building, where we see the classic, sort of a classical idea of structural stability and masculinity, here we have to figure out a slightly different understanding of what we're seeing here, right? In this sort of weird floating scaffoldy stuff that it doesn't seem to be holding together very well, right? It's like a veil almost, So I'm sort of protesting against a little bit the tendency in architecture to sort of think that structure has to be powerful
Hmm.
in and that and this libidinal aspect is comes out. um and it's for someone to decide whether they like that or not. I'm sort of like not exactly neutral on it. I think it's an easy place to be, for architects to assume a type of masculine assumption about engineering. That's what I'm
Hmm.
saying.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of a weird libidinal facility, whereas I'm looking for the architects who try to go past that, not fall into that trap.
Yeah. Um, we talked a lot about the kind of this idea of rupture. How do we mend this rupture? You said, you think things are heading in the right direction, and they probably periodically do. How do we take that right direction and make it? How do we not just plaster over, but how do we actually resolve a little bit of this dichotomy, if it's possible? Given all that we've said, if it's possible?
No, it's very possible. I think it's a little bit how we teach. I mean, MIT. I love all my colleagues, and they're really great, and I have a lot of fun. Knowing them and so forth. But basically, MIT, like many design schools, right, uh, doesn't look at the building industries as something you would talk about, right? So it doesn't look at construction as a something you would talk about in a theory class, right? So in my thinking about architecture class, we talk a lot about construction histories, and its ideologies and its perspectives. I'm not teaching them how to make buildings. I'm not teaching them about how to construct. I'm teaching them that construction is, in some sense, a presence, right? In fact, in the United States, I think it's like 98% of all buildings are not made by architects.
Mm-hmm.
Architects just come in for the either the millionaires who want a villa, or for skyscrapers or large buildings and so forth like that. They just announced today a large 10 building campus, outside of Boston. Huge, ginormous. Um, and I doubt an architect was involved in that. It just looks like something you just press a button on a computer and you get a dumb building. And the real estate market knows how to make buildings. They can do in their sleep. They don't need an architect, except to maybe sign the paper and to give it to the city. So we're facing a dilemma, is that basically the tecton world, the world of the builders and the makers and the fabricators, right, is basically eaten away by the developers, who give all these people their jobs, right, and which is great, but they don't really give them a voice either, right? They take sort of the worst part of it and make that into architecture. And I think there have been a lot of people who exist in the world of makers and in the world of fabricators and so forth, who are really trying to assert themselves as having a voice. I'm a little bit. I mean, I think digital fabrication has done a lot of that labor, and I applaud that. I'm not always happy with the results, but that's maybe just a different question. So I think that's like one place where we can begin to see a type of creative work that comes from the making of things, that doesn't just champion the romantic idea that making things by hand is the best way to go. That's fine if you want to make a barn up in Vermont and you want to do it by yourself. Absolutely great, but it doesn't upscale into larger things.
Mm.
So I think we're moving in that direction. But my point in the book is that these old systems are not going away. We're not changing in the United States the Library of Congress system. We're not changing, the idea that design schools teach towards brilliance, towards the genius, things like that.
That's a very interesting and provocative point to finish on. Thank you very much, Mark. I've greatly enjoyed speaking to you.
Ambrose, it was great to chat with you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book.
Alberti said a man can do all things if he but wills them. That's obviously nonsense, but they may do one thing, and that's buy and read Mark's book. Thanks to him for the conversation and Bloomsbury for the book. Links to both are in the podcast description like normal. Thanks for listening.